Fine people of the internet, you may notice today that we have an honorary chairman who, in all likelihood, supersedes us all in his knowledge and understanding of electronics, pedalboard building, and all other associated topics. Also just a generally nice guy, the great Barry O'Neill.
You had me until that last one, Mason. The nice guy part, I just cannot. The other lies were fine, but that last one I cannot abide.
Well, consequentially, I went to Nashville recently, and Barry and the fine gentleman of Xact took me to a beautiful lunch where we enjoyed barbecue, some of Nashville's finest, and then a wonderful tour of the Xact facility and some of the things that they were working on. So I cannot be more grateful to them for their hospitality. And today we are going to, and I had to give you that sort of preamble there, Barry, because we are going to force you to have to talk about a few topics that I think are of interest to us and also I think our audience generally. Some of which are summing, which is something that as many of you believe, but maybe are going to have your dream shattered today. Summing may or may not be the panacea that you think it is tone-wise. We're going to get to talk about why you may or may not want to do that. And we're also going to talk about my favorite topic, which I get accused of talking about too much, buffers. We're going to talk about building the right pedal board for the gig. Tone beer goggles, a new term that's been coined here. And because we know when the lights are off, all of our rigs are a 10. And we are going to talk about some other assorted topics related to those topics. If you just saw what I did and I just moved it all back together in one big loop. So with that said, welcome, Barry. Thank you for being here. We love having you. This is Barry's second visit on the Chairman of the Board show. Anything you'd like to say before we dive into this? This is just giving you an opportunity to clear the air before we force you to answer these questions about the topics just mentioned.
No, I think we can jump right into it. I think, I bring my greetings and Greg and Eric as well. We're super glad to be here with you guys. We are avid listeners, watchers of the podcast, so we're glad to play a small part in it when we can. So glad to be on here again with you guys.
I was hoping for a hi, Eric. His signature line. I'll call it in about 5 minutes. I'll have him stick his head in here when he gets here.
Yes.
All right. And let's maybe start with the idea of summing. And I know that this is not something that is unusual to offer. And I've done it at various points. Grant offers summing. And I know that for most of us, it's a response to, not because we think it's the best thing in the world, but because the customer has this belief that if you have two amplifiers that your pedal board is set up for, let's say a stereo rig, and then you're at certain events where you're not able to carry a stereo rig and need to use mono, that there's this thing called summing, where in essence it takes the left and right and it puts them together into a mix where you're essentially getting all of the goodness of both channels, but in a single output that's going to a mono amplifier, and the problems are solved. That's true, right, Barry?
The answer is always a very unsatisfying.
Just black
maybe.
And white, please.
Yeah. There obviously is a reason for it. I mean, you got Grant's interfaces. Several of the Goodwood interfaces have summing, and if a guy needed it, I would say go with one of those. We get requests for it on a regular basis, and have built them into interfaces in the past. But usually, and Grant, I'd love to hear your weigh in on this. Usually when a guy says, I need summing, and I ask why, they don't know. And I think a lot of
You just
it
know
is
that you need it. You know that you need it.
yeah.
That's
Well,
where
I think a lot of it is sort of a fear of missing out thing. It's like I've gone through all this trouble I've got my left and my right and all this stuff. And if I just listen to the left, then what's going on over there on the right? Like all the cool stuff might be over there, and I don't want to lose half my signal, I think is the thought. If you, this is actually, I think the first article that I wrote for PG was about this summing thing. And I thought, like, what's the case where it makes the most sense? And I think the one of them is, and I'm sure there's more, like ping pong delays, right? So let's say the left is the ping and the right is the pong. If I just listen to the left, then I'm missing all those pongs. And if I'm playing a pong-based song, then I don't want to miss half of that stuff where all the mojo is. So you might want to sum those things together to not lose those things. I think in practice, there are some issues that maybe most folks don't think of that wind up, making it not so obvious, not so. There's some sort of sleeper cons in there that folks often don't think of.
Yeah.
When I knew that you guys wanted to chat about this, I'm like, all right, here we go. Let's chat about it. Because I have this on a bunch of our products, and it all started in probably 2011, where a customer asked us for this. And I'm still relatively clueless. Let's be honest. I was more clueless back then. And I think the customer asked, like, oh, can you do this? And it was at the point in the company where, I'll say yes to anything and I'll go figure it out. I'll spend 20 hours on figuring this thing out just because I want to make you happy. And so we ended up figuring it out, built it for them in the junction. And the whole reason the customer wanted it, which I think was actually really valid, is they were used to using tube amps. This was before amp sims were hugely, hugely popular. They did exist, but were not hugely popular. And his tube amps had died. One of them, I think the right amp, he said, had died mid-gig, and he lost half of his DD5 ping pong delays. He lost his pong. No guitar player wants to lose their pong. This is the beginning of a tragic
tale as old as time.
Like the script is writing itself. And so we can build that in. You flick a switch and it'll take your left and right from your pedal board. It'll merge it together. And at that point, it would send it to one amp. It would send it to the left amp only. And it's like, in that context, as an emergency backup, I think this is a great thing. And then since then, obviously, you do more and more tests and you run more and more options and all that, and you realize that summing is not all it's cracked up to be. However, in certain contexts, in an emergency situation, for us, this is where this was born out of. I run stereo all the time. If a tube amp dies, until the next song, I just want to send my whole stereo signal to one amp. And I think in that context, it's awesome and a really good backup. The downsides, though, are obviously, and I've done a bunch of videos on this on our YouTube channel. The downside is if you have something like a chorus or certain tremolos that are, hard panning, hard left, hard right, hard left for the trem, and you sum that signal for a chorus, it'll significantly diminish the chorus effect. For a hard panning tremolo, it'll sound like you turn the tremolo off. It'll just completely cancel itself out. Not ideal. And so we've had to come up with workarounds over the years. Now all of our boxes come with two types of summing. One that's, favors modulation, one that favors delay and reverb, which delay and reverb tend to sum better than modulation effects. But still, at the end of the day, I tell my customers, what are you going to run 90% of the time? And I'm like, stereo. It's just wire your rig up for stereo, have summing for an emergency backup. And if they say, I run mono most of the time, just run it for mono. We'll give you the option for dual mono really easily. But don't set up your board for stereo if you're going to run stereo once a year. It's just not worth it. And so that's where everything kind of came out of. And, it kind of can be touted as summing is the same thing as running a stereo rig, but you just unplug all your right cables from all of your stereo effects and you're just running to 1 amp. That's exactly the same as summing. And it just isn't, unfortunately. I wish it was. It would be awesome if it was. But it started as an emergency kind of backup thing. And even still, I have a lot of customers, they come to me and they say, I only run delay and reverb in stereo. Like, summing will be pretty good. It'll get you a good chunk of the way, but run some tests with your presets and your sounds and see if it actually sounds as good as mono for how you run your presets and for the pedals that you use. And a lot of the times, most of my customers are really happy when they know that summing is not perfect. Then they run the tests and then they find out for their rig and their sounds. But yeah, summing, I think summing is a good thing to be aware of how it works. It's a good thing to have in your toolkit, but it is not the be all and end all. I will say, though, the other thing, I don't know if you guys have done these tests. I've kind of been forced to do these tests because of all the questions I get about it. Like, will it work for my rig? There are certain effects, certain choruses, certain tremolos, like Flint is a tremolo reverb by Strymon. Flint, the trem side, sums great because it's not a hard panning trem. And certain choruses, certain stereo choruses are chorused on the left side, dry on the right side. And that is the stereo chorus in air quotes. And those sum great as well because there's no phase cancellation. But like you really kind of just need to know at the end of the day that summing is not going to be perfect, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's just,
I think that case. Oh, go ahead, Mason. I'm sorry.
No, Barry, I want you to talk. Go for it, and then I'll come in after you.
Well, I think Grant brings up some great points, and that emergency scenario is one that I had not considered or had somebody ask for. I think that's maybe the best reason to do it. As I was thinking about it last night, like what would be good things to sum, that chorus, those older school boss choruses where the stereo thing was vibrato on one side, dry on the other. Summing there is great because
like
it's
the
actually
CE one for
it restores the effect. If you're monitoring one side of a CE pedal and you've got the pedal hooked up in stereo so that the pedal thinks that it's in stereo, then if you're monitoring that one side, all you're going to get is that ee-ah vibrato. And once you sum that dry back in, you're going to get the chorus effect back. So in that case, summing is going to save the day. What we've done in the past here recently, we had a guy with a super chorus that wanted to rig wired up stereo, but in the times that he went mono, the chorus, we had to add a switch to sort of make the chorus think that it was hooked up mono, that
so
right
it short
jack
the second output or something like that on the jack.
No, actually in that one it had plugging something in to that secondary jack would make would trigger a FET that would kill the dry going into the chorus output. So plugging something into that right jack would kill the dry going to the mixer that was mixing the vibrato and the dry to make the chorus. So
that mod is probably more expensive than the pedal. That's not an easy mod.
Well, you guys know how it is. It's like somebody says, "Can you do that?" I mean, Grant already alluded to it. You know, like, "Can you do that?" And the answer is always yes. It makes it really hard to answer the question.
But how important is it to you? How much are you willing to spend?
It's like time. I always tell people, like, we went to the moon. This is possible, but you probably don't want to do it, or you probably would not assign enough value to this thing to actually do it. That wasn't too bad. The guy had a whole fleet of choruses, so you can kind of spend your time it kind of looking at the schematic. Usually with those, I'll say, let me look at the schematic and see if this is going to fall out. Because if it looks like it's simple, then if it looks like it's really simple, I know we can do it and only slightly slit our throats on it. If it looks like it's going to be difficult, then that means it's probably impossible. So, that all that digression to say like chorus makes great sense to me. Emergency backup, that makes great sense to me. I think a lot of things I never really heard anybody talk about before was when you sum. So like think of like, let's go back to ping pong delay. So the left is dry plus pings, and the right is dry plus pongs. And if you sum those together, you have pings plus pongs, happy day. Like we got them both. But now you've got two copies of the dry in phase with one another, and you're going to sum those together. So now your summed output is pings, pongs, and 2 times the dry. So if you're taking that same signal and running it to backline, unless you're just running this monster amp, like a Boogie Strategy 400, right? Where you've just got headroom for days. If the amp is anywhere near breakup and is already in that limiting, it's starting to limit, you're going to cram 2 times the dry in it, and it's going to do something different anyway. So to Grant's point, if you're just talking about saving the day, then yeah, sum it and let it ride. But if you're talking about, I got to get my presets dialed and all that stuff, you're going to have to rework all the mixes anyway, because the amp is going to choke on the extra dry, and it's going to feel like everything leaned out. Well, no, I take that back. It will feel like everything got wetter because that double dry is going to get limited and compressed. So your pings and your pongs are down here, and the amp should pass double the dry here, but the amp can't do that. So it's going to hard limit it, and now it's going to feel like relatively the effects came up. So the kind of the last thing in my mind on it is, well, you've got a DSP engineer who figured out what he wanted these things to sound like in stereo. He got a reverb that has all these phase relationships to make it feel like it's doing something like this. Well, what happens when you take those and you just sum those 2 channels together? Whatever it is, it probably wasn't what the engineer had in mind, or whoever, the tastemaker or whoever was judging it. And that doesn't mean it sounds bad, but it does mean that maybe you want to listen to it critically and see if it's really doing the thing that you want it to do.
Yeah, that was what my hand was raised for there, by the way. It was one of the key elements of that Premier Guitar article that Barry had written, and we'll link that in the description, was the duplication of the dry signal. And that's kind of one of the unintended consequences, because it's basically the same as doubling. Like if you had a Pro Tools session and you doubled your guitar, and you have twice as much information now coming into that mix, it's really can overwhelm things. Sorry, Greg.
Yeah, which is fine, as so long as the system is acting linearly. You could do that in Pro Tools and double the output of something, and it'll be twice as loud. And that's how math works. The problem is, in a digital system, you have a certain headroom by the size of the memory register where we're holding that. You got X amount of bits, right? You got 128 bits, you got 8 bits. If I add up a number that's too big to be held in there, so I can't just keep doubling numbers forever. Everybody knows on the calculator, if you keep multiplying again and again and again, it's going to say overload or out of range or whatever. That's the problem that we're talking about. Now, a tube amp, which I should say does overload way more gracefully than your Texas Instruments calculator did in high school, it will overload and it'll start rounding things off and squishing things and trying to keep, but the rails are the rails. You can only get a signal this big out of there. Now, all the fun stuff does happen up here, but it's a dynamic thing that you're, if you're already pushing that, you're just going to drive up harder into that, and things may or may not be what you really want.
I was going to add to it the amount of summing boxes. I do all of the interfacers, underfacers, output boxes from Goodwood. The amount of times I've had people request the summing box, and then, I talk them through everything. I even explain how the summing works and stuff because you hold down the foot switch. And a year later, I'm like, so how's the board? How's the summing? They're like, I don't think I've ever even used summing. And I'm like, oh, I completely forgot about it, which is nice because it's a hidden feature. But I think there's people that like, it's like this wet, dry, wet board I did for this guy. It has all these, it's actually a Goodwood box that Grant and them did. And it's a crazy awesome box. And I asked the guy, I was like, oh, why does it have this and have this? And he goes, oh, just in case. And I was like, just in case of what? And he goes, yeah. And that was it. Like that was the reason. And there might be some down the line reasons of why he did or whatever, but I've had people that they're like, oh yeah, well someone's recommended to me, but I only run, I always run stereo, but everyone's like, you have to get summing, and I don't. So like it's I think it's a lot of conception of like people's other opinions also influencing why people are doing summing or whatever. And I think Grant said about using it as like that one bad amp went down. I never thought about that either. Like that's a very smart way to think about it. Which also reminded me, Grant, does summing now go up with compressors of things that you still don't quite fully understand? We were talking about this a couple podcasts ago.
Oh, back in the day for sure, but now that I've had to do hundreds of tests,
now you know. Yeah, and I think there's like I don't even use summing. Yeah, I don't even use summing. Like I like for my stuff because I have an analog board and I have the quad Cortex. But where I play with the analog board, they have stereo amps. So I think a lot of it times comes down to like option galore too. Like people have the option to do it, so they think they have to do it when in terms they might not actually need it. So. But I think it's interesting how people just forget half the time they have the option.
I think there's some electronic reasons. One concern that I've always had in doing it is one, if I'm going to add a sum, that means I got to add active circuitry on the back end. Hypothetically, I'm sure you could come up with another scenario, but the simplest thing would be to both the outputs or the output that is summable or would be the output of the sum, that really will be the output of a mixer. And that mixer is probably always, or could be always in line. Well, now to Brian's point, I potentially have a customer or client who has an extra active device in there that he never uses that, by virtue of you have to pay the thermodynamic piper, it's going to add noise, a little bit of, then there's the ground loop issue, right? So it's like, how am I going to power that mixer? Because if I've got a buffer in the front and a mixer on the back, now the entire interface is all at one ground potential. And I'm potentially going to make a giant loop in the board that, depending on what's going on EMF wise, I could pick up some hum or something. So all that to say, if somebody needs it, you give people what they need. If somebody thinks that they have to have it and will be unhappy if they don't get it, even if they never use it, you give them what they need. If they need that to be happy with the board, then you do it. My concerns, I think the reason why we don't do a lot of it is when I'm interfacing with a client and asking them, it usually, again, like Brian was saying, it winds up not being sort of a pillar of what they're wanting to do with the board. It's something that they don't really care about, at least for the people that I've talked to about it. And so it's kind of the first thing off the block.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. Grant, was there anything else that you wanted to chime in about? I know that you were going for a second, and then I think I interrupted you.
No, I was just curious because I've done so many tests with this on, all the different scenarios and contexts. And I was just curious about the double dry thing, because I'm aware of that when I've been doing line mixing and, doubling up dry in very specific contexts is blatantly obvious. Like everything just jumps up in volume. But if I ever sum, let's take an easy one that we're all very familiar with. If I ever sum like a DD5 or a Strymon timeline, 2 delays, and I sum those together, even if I only have one amp plugged in, let's say, so it's running in stereo, but I'm only plugged into one amp, so I'm getting half the stereo field in stereo, and then I sum it, the dry doesn't double up in that context, audibly double up. And that's where I'm curious, even on an interface where I'm reading levels and stuff and I'm seeing peaks and all that, it doesn't double up. But if I were to mix down or sum two separate sound sources with dry in them, then it absolutely doubles up, and I can see and hear that right away. So are you saying, Barry, that it's kind of like it's more subtle in that context? I think I'm just trying to understand, because when I've doubled up dry, like I was saying, it's unmissable. But I haven't gotten that unmissable double up on, solid state amps, interface, all that type of thing. And I'm curious to run more tests is basically what I'm getting to, like, so I can actually see what you mean in the summing context of a single source pedal. Like what's a way I can actually test that out of my rig?
I think a good, if we're going to test it electronically, I think just start conceptually with that idea of you've got those two channels of stuff. It's dry plus left effects, dry plus right effects. That'll always sort of be true philosophically.
Yeah.
If I run a simple math operation on that, then we can see how the double dry sort of follows. So the only thing left to rule out, if you're not seeing it electronically, is, well, what is the mixer actually doing? Because if I put a mixer is just an adder, right? So it takes in this case two values, and it's going to add this one to this one. So if there's one here and one here, I'm going to add them together to get two. You should get that invariably. So if you have a summer that's doing its nominal job in adding together, and I put a 1K sine wave to the right and a buffered copy of that 1K sine wave to the left, and they're in phase, you're going to add those up and you're going to get twice the amplitude out. You should see that invariably. I'm wondering, in the case that you're talking about, Grant, if the monitoring is a thing, because we're so bad at hearing sort of absolute levels, and we're bad at hearing distortion, especially the nice sort of distortion that tube amps sort of do, that if I double the input to a tube amp, it'll lie to me and kind of tell me, that's about the same. Yeah, it'll just sound, maybe there's a little more
squishier,
second order or whatever, and it can be kind of hard to tell. The same reason, like we were kind of joking about earlier, why people will spend 20 minutes dialing in a compressor and then realize they spent the last 20 minutes dialing a compressor that was in bypass, because compression is not a thing that we're super dialed in to recognizing. Not like intermodulation distortion or something that's harmonic, overtly harmonic. So the real dead reckoning way to look at it is you put it on a scope with signals that are easy to parse, just sine waves, and you could do you could take two generators and sum in things that are like not harmonically related to different values, and then see what your output is. But what you should see at the output of a true summing mixer is both inputs, or however many inputs, all added together. And if they were just sine waves, then the predominant thing should be that double dry, so to speak.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, that's good.
Break out the fluke and
yeah, exactly. Well, I have the scope here and everything, but I always do, obviously, like I'll test stuff on a scope, but then I'll also do more of a real world thing. And when I do a real world example with delays and reverbs being the most popular thing to run in stereo for my customers, at least. Audibly, a DD5 sums really well. It sounds great, but there's no modulation in there. There's no, all these other things that don't sum well attached to it. But yeah, I've never heard the extreme double dry that I get when I sum two different sound sources with dry in them, and then everything jumps up very, very noticeably. So yeah, I'll definitely do some more tests. I'm very curious to try and see if I can pick it. But that's cool. I like the insight.
Yeah. Well,
sorry, I was just going to go to an ad if that's all right, Mason.
Be my guest.
Okay. So on the back of the Summing Chat, I want to tell you guys a couple of the sponsors that make this chat possible. And the first one is the Guitar Sanctuary. The Guitar Sanctuary, where Brian is currently located, is where you can buy incredible gear, a lot of the stuff that we chat about on this podcast. And the good thing about the Guitar Sanctuary, you can get all of your amps, guitars, your pedals. They're based in McKinney, Texas. If you're in the area, you can actually just show up in person. You can also order online, but after you get your gear, you can get Brian himself to actually set up your pedal board for you, put it into one cohesive system, and you are ready to go. And as we actually learned a little while ago, a few episodes back, Andy Timmons is also a frequenter of the Guitar Sanctuary. Some might say you can't keep him away. And so I think you guys should probably check out the Guitar Sanctuary, see what they have on offer, and you won't be disappointed. I also want to tell you guys about Neural DSP. They are the makers of the Quad Cortex, an incredible multi-effects amp and cab sim unit, one of the best ones on the market for sure, but they also do incredible plugins. And we have a code for you today, which I'm just going to bring up here. You can use the code Chairmen, and you can get 30% off all of the plugins at Neural DSP if they are 90 days or older. So
and
all
the
of the brand new
amps
plugins
just hit it.
Just hit 90 days.
Yeah,
that's definitely one to check out. You guys are going to love the Morgan Amp suite. And so all of their plugins, 90 days or older, use the code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN. And you can also check out the Quadtex and, of course, relatively new still this year, Cortex Control, which is a desktop editor. We've been waiting for this for your Quad Cortex. You can go even deeper, do much quicker edits across a lot of presets with Cortex Control. Lots to check out at neuraldsp.com. I will throw it back to you, Mason.
Hey,
Beautiful.
I want to interrupt real quick.
Yeah, Brian.
Neural did. Speaking of Neural, they did just put out a post, I think today or yesterday, that Core OS 3.0 will come out shortly. It's the next firmware update.
That's actually one better than 2.0. Hey,
right?
Yeah.
Right, and it's supposed to feature the highly anticipated plugin capability of loading your plugins into the Quad. So, side note for that guy.
Yeah,
here we are. That's good.
So yeah, I had to throw that in.
Yeah, no, we've had some. We just shot a really cool video with this R&B guitar player that really I think is on the Mount Rushmore of R&B guitar players in particular for 90s guitar, Jubu Smith. And we used the JC120 because he wanted this really pristine, clean, almost DI-esque sound. Took away the chorus, added a little reverb, and just ended up using that on the whole video. And it sounded really spectacular for that type of thing. So
was it built into the Quad Cortex, or is it one you guys
this
captured?
is the JC120 that's in the Quad Cortex, and so
Awesome.
we tweaked it obviously to his liking, but we're gonna publish that also on our the Neural Cloud,
Nice.
so that people have access to that if they want to have the Jubu Smith preset. But I think, given that we've covered something, there was another thing that we kind of brought up briefly in the conversation, which was kind of around the idea of people wanting to put excessive options on their pedal boards. And Brian was kind of talking about how people will have him add features, but they're unexplored. He comes back to them years later and they've never used it. And I think that this is a good transition into one of the other topics that Barry and I had discussed previously that I think is really worth talking about, which I've sort of consolidated to kind of call it building the right rig for the gig. And maybe another way to say that is, how do we not overfill or put features on our pedal board that are not relevant to the thing that we're actually doing. I don't know if there's a more articulate way to say that, but if somebody could say that, I think it would be very, very. Could you help flesh this out a little bit better for the listener about what exactly it is that you what am I trying to say here? Tell me.
Something. I think it was something about me being very handsome and winsome.
That's it.
And,
That's the code. Yeah.
Yes.
and super humble. I think that was the thing that you were trying to say.
Nailed it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
I think it's building the rig for the gig that you have and not the gig that you want or the some fantasy gig. The way it sort of manifests here is the way it has before is we'll have usually a younger guy who has gotten their first major gig and
A-list celebrity.
yeah.
They're off Broadway now.
Exactly. So it's that now the time is it's go time for them in their career. It's time to get serious. They want to get a board done. And the danger is that they start adding everything they've ever used and everything that they think they could ever use. And it winds up being this 4 foot by 2 foot monstrosity.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was, we've already talked about this some. When I was younger and this custom shop was going, I would be like, yes, sir, right away, sir. We'll do that for you. And I remember I've got several sort of touchstone moments where after delivery, a guy was like, this is a little bit bigger than I was thinking. Or
and heavier.
They get it out. Yeah, and heavier. And for a lot of these guys, heavier, or for a lot of these situations, heavier doesn't necessarily matter because what do they care? Some stagehands carrying it. But it brings up a good point because now the stagehands have to carry this heavy thing. And so now the sociological dynamic is you've got this young buck on his first gig and he's bringing this monster pedal board and all these old dog stagehands are having to carry this thing around. And so it's like instant resentment. And then you've got this big monster board because you're at the beginning of your career and you kind of shot the moon on the board and you put everything that you own on one board. Now you have no other board. So this is the only board that you have is this giant board. So when you go play the Opry and your employer is playing one song, 2.5, 3.5 minutes worth of music, and you load into the Opry and bring this surfboard to the stage edge, all the Opry guys are looking at you like, what are you doing? Like, this is...
Yeah.
We don't do this here. And so I've seen that cause consternation in the players. And so now that'll weigh kind of heavy on me as we're kind of figuring out, who goes where and who's getting what. And, making a board that actually corroborates with what it is that you're going to be doing. It seems super obvious. Like, why would you add a bunch of stuff that you don't need? But we all do it. It's like I look at, thinking about boards that I would build for myself, and you start off like, well, I just need this, and I should probably have this, right? And
if I'm
maybe
gonna
I
have
should.
that,
I need this too.
Yeah.
And it becomes, Steve Martin in The Jerk, right? It's like, well, I need this. I need my dog. Well, I guess I don't need my dog. That sort of thing. And so, as easy as it is to say, don't be excessive, don't add a bunch of stuff you don't need. In practice, it's really hard to do because, again, it's that fear of missing out. And so you find even though it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, it's like, okay, I played a Grateful Dead cover band thing 5 years ago, so this board should really have an envelope follower on it. It just, even though you're never going to use it, you just signed on with a pop country act and you're never going to turn that pedal on. And it's actually kind of hard on boards too, because you make this great big board with all this stuff on it, and you wind up having to cannibalize it, right? Because it's got everything you own on it. So if you need to go do something where this would be obscene, you wind up pulling stuff off of it and doing something small and then sticking it back onto it. And then all the dual lock teeth are getting mashed, and now nothing sticks to the board at all. And so now when you got delivered, it was this beautiful, pristine thing. And then in 6 months, it's been torn to pieces because you had to and shoved back together. And so now it was big and pretty, and now it's big and ugly. And there's almost no winning aesthetically with the deal. So it's a trap for sure. You think you're going to need something, you got to have this pedal, and you may not even have heard it before, but it's like, I got to have this on my board or I'm going to die. And it's I can't explain it, but it doesn't matter, how that idea persists up to the tippy top. Creme de la creme guitar players hang their poster on your wall. Not all of it. It gets less and less as people sort of ascend, because I think we all, as we mature in life and career and art and all those sort of things, there's a natural sort of distillation process that happens. But it's still there. I can think of a couple guys who are still, I'm thinking, listen, people are copying what you're doing and have been for decades, and you're afraid. We've rehashed your board several times or whatever's going to go on it, and we're like, okay, it's done. We're everything's, all stakeholders have been satisfied and all that, and you're about to walk out the door, and he turns on his heels and says, "Is there anything else I should put on here?" Like that. And it's like, no, dude, you're good. Why don't you just play all the hits that you have? You'll be fine.
Yep.
Yeah.
I feel like I'll be a broken record here again, but I am a massive fan of the Pareto principle, like 80-20 rule, and I think it absolutely applies to pedal boards. And this is where I think people won't necessarily take your word for it as someone that builds rigs, but if you can get your board down to the pedals you use 80% of the time and ditch the other 20, or whatever your percentage is, it doesn't really matter. But if you can get into the headspace of getting rid of the things you rarely touch, it will make you a better guitar player. Absolutely, without a doubt, you will be a better guitar player because you will have less pedals, but you'll have to play the same songs. If you did, do a Grateful Dead cover, for your example, and your envelope is gone, you're going to have to get creative with what you have. Like, you have to figure something out. You might mess around with a tone knob on your guitar, or you might be trying to look deeper in other pedals that you have and find sounds you didn't know were there. Like, you will get better because of your creative limitations. And I think limitations themselves will absolutely breed creativity, and you will very quickly realize you actually have a lot more in you to offer when your crutches have been removed. Like when you're forced, when you're pushed out of the nest, as it were, for my metaphor-rich explanation here, you just have to step up and you'll figure it out. But until you're willing to be uncomfortable, in this case, in your pedalboard rig and your pedalboard and the sounds you have, easily accessible, until you're willing to step away from that, you will never realize what you can actually come up with. And I'm such a huge fan. Even if you didn't have to get rid of 20%, I would still be like, but just what could you, like, if you had to, what would you get rid of? And like, just see what happens over the next 6 months. Just reflect back and you will realize that you had to change how you played, and it will be a good thing.
I have, like I said, I have two small boards. I have the quad board, which is just a quad. And then I have one that has a delay and a reverb, one overdrive, one boost, and a modulation, some like Emperor, JHS something. And I've had friends who are like, man, that sounds really great. What are all the pedals? And I tell them, and they're like, that's it? And I'm like, yeah, I have one overdrive and one boost. I'm very, very simple. Seeing like 6 to 8 overdrives on board sometimes for me. To me personally, and if you're mad at me, get off my lawn. I'm
mad.
It's mind-boggling. Like, I don't understand how someone utilizes 8 different overdrives sometimes for 4 songs. I get they're all different stages. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're all just stacked together. But I've recommended to people, I'm like, to be honest, building these big elaborate boards, they are fun. They are fun to build. They're fun to put together. Sometimes they can be headaches, but putting them together, that's fun. Like, I just did this one down here on my floor. It's like this big wet, dry, wet, everything in the kitchen sink and the dog. Like, it's just everything. And it was fun to put together, but realistically, I would never use something like that live. I would pick something significantly smaller. And if you're playing all these different types of genres, that's where I think like the H9 or something, or the M5 or something we just talked about in the past podcast, comes into play, to where you can dial up different tones that you need, or have like a little MC6 and it can change to different types of sounds. So you're not having to go a 4-foot wide pedal board when you can bring it down to a smaller size. So I think in theory, big, elaborate, everything boards are fun, but realistically, there's also way more to troubleshoot, especially if something gets dislodged or in traveling. That's always like when I send off boards, I'm like saran wrapping the crap out of these boards and bubble wrapping them and making sure nothing moves, because dear God, if something happens in shipping, it's out of our hands, but that's a whole different story. But when the client gets it and then they have it and then something happens, there's just way more stuff to have to troubleshoot. So it's a love-hate relationship, I think, with big rigs. And
as well, I have to
simplicity.
say, if it is a bigger rig, it's Murphy's Law, and also it's just the law of physics. A bigger board has more inertia. And if it's going to get damaged, it's going to be a big board. Like, shipping companies, they destroy big boards. Not all the time. I think I usually have, maybe one board a year that a shipping company will damage. So like the percentage is very low, but it's always a big board. And that, like, if a big board gets dropped, once that thing gets moving, all the pedals inside, they will keep moving with all that extra weight inside.
It's like dominoes.
It is frustrating. And TSA, they see a big board, they will rip it up. Like, again, all the nightmare stories, Michael Pope comes to mind. TSA ripped up every single pedal on his board, all the cables, and it was this gigantic thing because I guess it looked suspicious. But a little small quad cortex board with a couple extra pedals on it, check it out, and it just keeps moving. And those things don't break.
They were 2 BAMP fans.
What's that?
Yeah.
They were 2 BAMP fans.
Yeah,
it was a personal.
There
It was
you
a
go.
personal vendetta from a 5e3 fanatic. This guy ain't getting out of here.
Yeah.
Not alive. Not in one piece, at least.
All the TSA guys are like huge, like Slipknot fans or something. And they're fans. Or Metallica.
Yeah, so big boards do come with many. They come with their pros. I mean, if you use everything and you can justify every pedal, all the power to you. But if you have a big board because you want a big board, I think you should reconsider and pare that thing back as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and Brian kind of alluded to it as well. If you have need for these things, more power to you, and let's figure out how to get them on a board and make them usable for you. I think where we continually run, it's symptomatic of the human condition, right? This isn't a guitar player problem, but that fear of I'm missing something, or if I don't do this, I'm not going to have any fun, or I'm going to be embarrassed, or these are all very powerful influences that play out in every arena in life. And picking, as silly as it is, picking pedals for your guitar rig is the case. I remember thinking, why does somebody need 6 or 8 drives on a board? And then I was sitting in on a print session with a guy in town, and those are usually very fast paced. Like, we're talking like 6 songs before lunch, 6 songs after lunch, sort of pacing. So you'll be in the control room, listen down to the song. Everybody walks out to the cutting floor, and I'm watching, it was Dave Cleveland, and he's got like 6 drives, and he steps on one, plays, nope, that's not it. Steps on another, nope, that's not it. Steps on another, that's kind of close. Let me stack it with this. And speed was the thing. He needed all these options laid out like some sort of tone charcuterie board so that he could taste test them all very quickly, because by the time the drummer sits down and it's time to go, we're not waiting. Nobody's going to wait for the guitar player to be like, hey, let me twist knobs for a little bit and see if I can find something cool. So in that case, this sort of what could be in another scenario an obscene amount of drives was totally justified. And but there is one guy who I can think of that you would all know and the listeners and viewers would all know. He got a big studio board made and a bunch of drive pedals on it. And when it came back in for maintenance or adding a pedal or something like that, every single pedal was dialed to sound as exactly the same as they could. This guy had a sound, and he just found that sound in 6 different pedals. And that he completely nullified the variety because he has a thing. And guess what? The board that he uses all the time and loves, it has 1 drive on it, and he's happier with that than he ever was with that big studio board. The board's like literally this big. That's the board that he wants and likes. That's the board that he needs. But even your guitar heroes are not immune to, I got to do a studio or session board, and my buddies all have a bunch of stuff, so I need a bunch of stuff, even though if I'm honest with myself, it's not really my thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'd be curious what you guys think in terms of if we were going to flip the conversation a little bit and say this is kind of maybe the current state and what we see, and there's some cons there. There's some negative maybe approaches there, or things that might be improved from our outside perspective. What would you guys tell people if they were coming to you saying, I want to build a board for I'm going out on tour with Taylor Swift, and these are the sounds I need to hit. How do I pick pedals? Like, what would you actually tell them if we are picking a pedal board for the gig? How do you do it? Like, what's the checklist? And to get us started, like, one thing that comes to mind for me, if you know the gig, presumably you know the songs or types of songs you're going to play, go through every pedal on your board and tell me when you're going to use it. Tell me give me song names. If you can't give me a song name within 5 seconds where you're going to use that pedal, get rid of it. And let's see what you end up with. And it's probably going to be 25%, 50% smaller than what you currently have, assuming you're starting with a big board. What would you guys, like, how would you advise people to pick better pedals, better gear for the gigs they're actually going to be playing? Rather than, I have to say, I love the charcuterie board analogy. That's brilliant. Rather than having it all available, how do you pair them?
I mean, I've always, anytime I give advice, I'm not an amazing guitarist. I'm not a shredder. I can get through, I play in the worship genre. That's really what I used to be in a hardcore band, but playing drop C and drop D, that's not that hard. A lot of open stuff. Chug, but not saying that there isn't talent in that, because there is, because I have a lot of clients that do stuff like that, and they're friggin' unreal, and could never do it even if I paid someone to teach me. And anytime someone has asked me, because they do that a lot, and that's the one thing it's not that I don't understand, it's that it's interesting how people will come and want a rig build, but they don't know what they want on it. They're like, tell me what I want on my board. I'm like, how many pedals you got? I got 80. Okay, well, first of all, you got to figure out what you actually use. And for like what you're saying for the Taylor Swift thing, I would first tell them to listen to all the songs you're about to listen to. Like you said, in the first 5 seconds, which is a yes and a no, because some parts, may add some cool effect that you can't hear it in 5 seconds. But I typically, like me, I will listen to any set list that I'm playing. In church music, it's all kind of around the same stuff. That's why I'll have like one pedal that can do a couple different sounds. Or an H9 that can do a bunch of different effects. So I know I need to pull up a Pog, or I need to pull up a chorus or something. But I typically like listen back, hear, see what you hear, hear what you hear, and write it down, figure out, do I have that pedal, and kind of go from there. Because if you have 3 fuzzes on your board for whatever reason, or you have a whole catalog of fuzzes and octaves, but the songs don't call for it, then you don't need it. I'm not saying you can't, because you could make it different. I've never played for to artists, so from what I could understand is they probably want you to play the part the way it was written and recorded. I'm gonna take a gander and a guess at that one. So I always tell people, just like listen to what you're trying to achieve, figure out the type of pedals. There's no reason to have a fuzz if it doesn't call for a fuzz. I mean, like that's typically my rule of thumb, really.
Yeah, I think I can't, like, we built those Taylor Swift rigs, so I could tell you what you need
Nice.
to do that rig. I've contractual obligations to not go in depth on Taylor stuff in particular, but I would say in general, there's a sliding scale of each production, how fastidious they are going to be about sounds and parts and stuff like that. On one end of the spectrum, you have people who hole up in the studio and record stems, and there'll be like an executive producer type that comes in, and they will literally A/B the sounds to record stems.
Wow.
To try to get them dialed in. Now, that might seem totally lifeless and unmusical to somebody, and I wouldn't fault you for thinking that. But for some of these acts, I think this is a scenario where it really makes sense. When you have a song that starts with a guitar riff, and it's a song you want, by the end of the first bar, everybody in the stadium, arena, club, whatever it is, let's be honest, we're talking about arenas, those sort of acts. By the time you get to the end of that first bar, you want everybody screaming, right? So that part and that sound can't just be evocative of the record. It needs to be exactly like the record, because you need an audience that maybe isn't super sophisticated when it comes to music. They just know what they like, and you need sort of a Pavlovian response to this intro. Well, the way that you do that is you make sure that it's dead nuts accurate to the thing that they've been listening to for years or decades. Now, so that's like on one end. And then on the other end, you got like Kenny Greenberg, who a lot of you probably know is a very accomplished session guitar player. He's playing in Kenny Chesney's band. What he loves about that band is, like how he refers to it, he goes, it's a bar band. He goes, we kind of we figure it out, and we play the music, and there's nobody, not that anybody would have the moral authority to do so, but there's nobody breathing down Kenny's neck about, well, you need to sound like this, and that was recorded with this guitar, and you need to do it. Well, Kenny recorded a lot of those parts, so he knows that anyway, and he'll do whatever the heck he wants, and it'll be awesome, whatever he does. So it really depends on the gig. I think the advice that we've already talked about, which is listening critically, if somebody's not taking care of it for you, as is the case in a lot of these bigger gigs, and they're like leaving it up to you to discover what it is that needs to be, listening critically to the tunes, probably after you've had a conversation with the MD or EP of the gig, is like, well, what is the expectation here? That, that everything be dead on, or are we taking liberties, or these arrangements? Because some bands, like I think of a band like Need to Breathe, no matter what their records are, they went through a season of like very indie, almost Mumford and Sons-esque records. Their show has always been a rock show. So whatever they did on the record, the actual concert was always a rock concert, and it has been since the very beginning, when they were making sort of more dyed-in-the-wool rock things. But a kind of putting everything that you're potentially looking at on trial for its life. What does this get me? What does this buy me? What will this enable me to do? Is it going to make my life easier? Is it potentially going to make my life harder? So like, if you're like, I think that M5 H9 idea that Brian was talking about is a great idea, depending on the player. If you're like, well, I know I need a multi-effect, so I'm going to get, but I've never used one. You guys were talking about this a couple weeks ago. I need a multi-effect, so I think I'll get an H9, even though I've never used one before. I would respectfully say, are you sure about that? Like, why don't you buy one first and sit with it for 30 minutes? And if you don't want to commit Harry Carey, then maybe let's put it on the board. Because it's a deep unit. And if I came to you, if I was a junior engineer at Eventide going to a product manager and say, hey, I want to make a pedal that does everything the time factor does, everything the pitch factor does, everything the space does, and everything the mod factor does, and I want it to have one knob on it, I would say that seems like a stretch. But yet here we are with the H9, and I think the H90 goes a long way to sort of alleviating that. And obviously the app thing has been a godsend, because there's been guys like Tom Bukovac who got an H9. He texted me, he said, I got an H9. And I thought to myself, I give it 2 weeks and this thing is going to be, he's going to off this thing. And it's still on his board. And what he does with it is a producer asks for something, and if he doesn't have it immediately, he just hands him his phone. He hands the producer his phone. He says, you do it. And I'm like, okay, that makes perfect sense. And now it's an escape hatch thing. It serves the rig. It serves him. He's got one patch in it that he kind of leans on. And then if somebody else needs something, they'll figure it out then. But it's that putting things on trial, I think, is oft overlooked and or ignored by most guitar players.
Jeez.
I've never actually learned. I think I said this on a previous podcast. I've never learned how to use the H9. I've had them. I've had multiples on my board. I've used them for years. And if I ever need to make a change, I just open up my phone and I only know how to use the app. But like, put me in front of the pedal, and I'm useless. I can change a couple of parameters. That's about it. But the app, it really is. Without the app, I never would have. The pedal would have lasted me less than a week. Not a chance.
Yeah.
See what you were saying about, which is funny how Grant says Taylor Swift and you guys did all that work
pretty
for
cool,
them,
by the way.
which I didn't know that, so that's super cool. And the fact that, like, you were talking about, like, what they've listened to and heard, like, they have to replicate exactly that. And there has been plenty of times I went to concerts. Like, I had the opportunity to go to a John Mayer concert, and I was like, oh, he's playing this one song, and the part I was so expected for him to play, but it's him. He wrote the music. He can play whatever he wanted. He played the part differently than I remembered, and a part of me was like, oh, I kind of wish it would have been the exact part, because that's what I've always heard and loved. But it's also John Mayer, so it's his music and do whatever the heck he wants. But I think that's such a good point to say, is like exactly that. It's like replicating exactly from the album, because those arenas of people, and yeah, they're screaming, they're crying, and they're listening, so they're not listening to that lead tone or whatever. Maybe they are, I don't know, maybe they're huge guitar fans or Taylor fans, but it's cool to see how detailed they will go to replicate stuff like that, like listening back. Like that's very, very detailed to go back and listen to the track and compare it and everything. That's a whole different level. So super cool though.
Well, I'm also excited to see what you guys are cooking up for Travis Kelce and his rig.
Yes. That's Taylor's boyfriend, right?
Coming up here soon. And I'm also just impressed that we were able to talk about Pavlov here. He doesn't get his much mention in Chairman of the Board.
I have it on my note cards. I didn't know how I was going to get it in. I was just waiting for the right opportunity.
Well, that's Brian's dog's name. So
yeah, it is.
So
drools a lot.
Is it really?
It does.
No. No. I just thought I would try to tie that into
that says no regrets.
Temporary,
No,
but yeah.
I wish it did. I wish it did. It's something like the Lord of the Rings related.
Yeah. Well, let's break for a second and talk about a few more sponsors that make the podcast possible. I'm going to turn it over to Brian so that he can relay this information so important to our listeners, and you get some good discounts out of it as well. Go ahead, Brian.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, we love discounts. We love good quality gear. So why not combine them together by hitting up the guys over at Mono Creators, creating some pretty cool stuff, I would say, pun intended, because I'm a dad. And they have a discount code for Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for 10% off gigs bags, soft cases, pedal boards, power supplies, carbon fiber flat boards. They have all sorts of great options. This is the one day I don't have a shipment of Mono Creative stuff coming in, but best be assured they will be here shortly. They have top-notch quality. It's quality over quantity. Even though you can have, I think I have like 5 or 6 bags, and I've had the same bags for years, never had issues. If you're looking to invest in something really well built, the guys at monocreators.com are the ones for you. And then the final sponsor are going to be the guys over at Bestronix or btpa.com. Brad and those guys, they have all sorts of parts, accessories, cabling, like loom stuff if you're building digital snakes or not digital, building audio snakes, anything you need. MIDI connectors, audio connectors, the square plugs, the 2.1, 2.5 barrel power connectors. They have everything. You won't be disappointed. Go use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off. Save at btpa.com. I'll throw it back to you, Mason.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and as we talked about, Bestronix has turned into a real animal sanctuary. They house thousands of feet of Cat 5, Cat 6. So God bless them. They're doing the Lord's work over there.
I'm going to do
it. I'd like to finish out our conversation today by talking about buffers. And I know that in the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned that we would be talking about this, and it's something that I still feel like as much content as I've attempted to put out there, and that there already is out there as it relates to buffers on YouTube and other places, there still seems to be a general lack of understanding about the purposes of a buffer when the qualities of a buffer is nullified, and I think also that just by consequence of having a buffer satisfies the need for it altogether. So, the X pedal has a buffered bypass, so I'm covered, speaking in terms of the unknowing customer, let's say. One thing that I did recently in this conversation about buffers, and we did a little short or reel on Instagram, and I just really quickly recorded a 10-foot guitar cable going into a Fender Bandmaster. So just a regular Mogami 2524 Strat, 10 feet of cable, recorded that. That's what I'm considering the bass line. That's how I would expect things to sound. And then I took a Boss pedal, a Klon, a Tube Screamer, and then our buffer, just one of the buffers. They're all the same. And and then had them drive 40 feet of that same cable into the same amp, just to see how these all respectively do with 40 feet. Now I'm using 40 feet arbitrarily. There were some people that said, well, we would never use 40 feet as an output cable. And that's true. But if you're considering all of the interconnections between every pedal, all of the plugs, the capacitance of all of the wiring, let's say in between the input and output jack and the switch, I think 40 feet of a decently low capacitance cable is probably generous in terms of what it would be adding to the sound. And then just seeing how those respective buffers in a true bypass loop driving the 40 feet of cable do relative to the baseline. And of course, there's always, depending on what buffer you have, it changes the tone to a greater or lesser degree, can change the EQ, can change the compression, all these things. I'm wondering, from the point of view of Xact tone, in Barry and I chatted a bit about this beforehand yesterday, but I think it's an important distinction for the listener to maybe understand. Firstly, maybe what your baseline is. Like, are you actually just going for the sound of your amp with a short cable and nothing in between? Or is there something that you want that enhances or alters the original sound in a way that you prefer? What's sort of like your approach at Xact Tone to buffers, and maybe like where do you feel like you need to supplement? Where do you feel like the pedals are servicing this function okay by themselves and don't need to have any sort of additional buffers? Like, kind of what's the buffering approach that you sort of endorse at Xact Tone?
We have a pretty lunch pail, pragmatic approach in general with all the stuff that we do, or at least we try to. I think the ethos would be not one more buffer than what you need. Because they all, even at their best, they're all going to add noise. Because you just, again, it's like my double E professor always said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so you can have a buffer, but you're going to have to take everything that it brings along with it. So, and I think another key thing that you mentioned, Mason, is what are we shooting for? If you have a rig setup that you love and it doesn't have any buffers in it, and that's not hurting you, like it's not making you inconsistent or, working farm. If that's not hurting you, making you inconsistent in certain scenarios, then I wouldn't add one. Because if you are locked into a thing, I'm not going to make it better by adding something. Now, if you're like, I really love this rig, but when I'm in this scenario, it feels like I'm losing a little bit of top end and stuff, and I kind of like it when I'm on this smaller stage plot, and when I go to this larger stage plot, I kind of don't like what happens. Then I'm going to start thinking, well, maybe we've got a cable loading issue that we need a buffer to protect you from, to try to preserve this scenario. So we try to be as responsive to whatever a client's needs are. And then if they've got stuff that they dig, we don't usually just wholesale dump it unless there's a real specific demand or reason to. I think the greatest thing is that, what are we going for? If you want, it's like that part of that, like I know I've seen the shorts come out and the promo stuff for it, but that Dan Huff thing, part of it is the fact that preamp is in the guitar and a relatively high impedance, and there's no cable loading, and that's why it sounds as glassy and clicky as it does. And
basically his buffer is in the guitar in his case.
Yeah, essentially. because the buffering, all a buffer kind of really means, I think, in the application that we're talking about, is something that doesn't load too bad on the input side, and the output side is able to has some drive capability. So what a buffer is doing is preventing the guitar pickup from interacting with things that are down the line. So the guitar pickup is always going to see the same thing. You take a boost circuit that has a relatively high input impedance, that's going to buffer the pickups from the later stuff, even though ostensibly the boost function is not buffering all by itself. It's a boost, but it has a buffering action. And so what you'll see is all that cable load gets dumped off the pickups. In addition to the mid boost, all of a sudden the high end is coming way up, because if you look at the resonant peak of the pickups, it's shifting out and moving up. So it's going to get clicky. Now you might say, that's disgusting, I don't want to do that. And you could be right. But if you want that thing, it's going to be very hard to do that thing after 20 feet of cable. Because as Neil Young says, the needle is in and the damage is done. You've already killed it, in some respect. So there's not going to be any restoration. So, I'll get calls from guys. They'll be like, I need a buffer. And again, it's like the pedal thing. It's the first question is, well, why? Why do you think you do? And sometimes they got great reasons. It's like, I'm driving half a mile of cable to backline, or whatever it is. And you're like, yeah, you need one. And sometimes they're just like, oh, I heard on the internet that if you don't have them, your wife, won't love you anymore. And so I got to have one. Yeah. And there's some truth to that too. I'll be frank. But if you're single, it doesn't matter. Just do what you need to do. But yeah, so as far as, hard and fast rules, we've been doing this long enough to know that any hard and fast rules I did have been broken 10 times over. So I don't want to make any more that are just going to get broken. So we try to be just uber responsive. I think the key things is understanding the loading of the instrument and the effectiveness of the buffer to drive things after it. I think a super common thing is once buffered, always buffered is a very common misconception. So I can have a buffer at the beginning of a thing, and that buffer runs into my original spec, full tone OCD, which is terribly unbuffered on its output, and I can turn that on.
10K or something like that on the output.
Yeah. So it's got a very high output impedance. When you turn that thing on, you are buffered. The instrument's buffered. The instrument can't see the OCD, so that's buffered. But now you're asking the OCD to drive that cable back to the amp, and it may or may not give you the results that you're looking for. So, it is not true that once you're buffered, you're always buffered. The buffer can't do anything about the output impedance of the things that come after it. So if you have something naughty after the fact, or just a poor performer after the fact, your buffer at the beginning isn't gonna address that. Your buffer is handshaking, a buffer at the front of the rig that you're plugging into with your instrument. It's only shaking hands with your guitar and the thing that comes right after it. And after that buffer is completely unaware of what's going on after it. Well, I guess until this AI thing gets driven down into buffers and everything is self-aware. But until then, your buffer is blissfully unaware of what terrible, awful, horrible things that you're doing after it.
I have a question. So, like, you were talking about running a cable to backline and using a buffer. In that circumstance, would you ever suggest like the radial SGI route? Like, if they're running that much cabling, is that another all? Because there's plenty of venues that I literally just set up a board for the guitarist from the band Intervals, and he has an SGI just at his board. So if his wireless that's in the rack goes down, he can just plug in and it sends XLR. Is it more common to suggest an SGI route than it is to just run a massively long, quarter-inch cable with buffers? Because I've done two different routes.
There's a couple different reasons you do it. Like for the guys that we're working with on a regular basis, there's a couple reasons. One, the long lines are not ideal. This whole system that we work on is very poorly conceived. Sending information over high impedance, unbalanced, is not the way that you do it. If you're looking at it on technical reasons, the problem with doing it the right way is it sucks. It doesn't sound the way that we expect it to sound. The SGI thing is a good idea because one, you've done all the tone stuff, right? So all the sensitive, everything's got to be just so, using 1950s technology, all that stuff's already done, and you've buffed it and you've manipulated it and screwed it up in all these sonorous ways, and everybody's happy. Well, now it's sort of static, and you can drive this transformer in the SGI thing, which balances it, and then you can send it to backline to a thing that will unbalance it there. The Goodwood long line stuff would be great for that as well. And you're probably going to get a nicer transformer too. The practical reasons for that is noise immunity, because when you're balanced, you're going to pick up because you're balanced driving a transformer. The transformer will only relate to its secondary the difference between things on its primary. So if I inject a bunch of noise on that cable, that noise will be rejected by the transformer. That's a huge boon if you're running across a deck that's got a bunch of AC on it, or maybe more apropos would be a bunch of DMX, like lighting control, which is high frequency, potentially high energy EMF that might want to work its way into your guitar rig and is in the audio band, which is bad. The other practical thing is tie lines in a professional situation, they're all going to be balanced. So if I am running a stage box down stage on the stage edge, I'm not going to find a bunch of unbalanced quarter-inch lines there, but there will be a bunch of XLRs there. So if I can translate my guitar rig into something that can tie into the infrastructure that already exists in the production, then that means I'm making everybody's life easier, and that's a good reason to do that too. So yeah, like we just had, they picked it up yesterday. John Osborne, Brothers Osborne, nice. His rack has a bunch of SGI transmit boxes in it, and they send from Guitar Tech World, where the rack sits, to a stage cart that has the amps and receive boxes on it, and it gives them more immunity and more consistency night to night, just depending on what it is. And then, those other sort of practical effects. So you do want to drive, and well, the radio box takes care of it because it has a front end that is buffering that signal and then buffering it such to drive the transformer, and then the receive box is passive because the way transformers work, it's just relaying all that stuff, and that buffer is technically driving both transformers and the input of the amp reflected through the transformer. So transformers are a magical, wonderful thing. They're the one device that is honestly like 90% of ideal, depending on if you're talking about nice enough stuff. Like a Jensen input transformer is like 99.9% of what I learned in school. All those rules still apply. Whereas with most everything else, even something as simple as a capacitor, they're like, oh, yeah. It doesn't do everything that you learn that it does, because it turns out we can't make a really great one. So it's got all these other things that are wrong with it. But transformers are super cool and will solve a lot of problems if you can spend enough money to get up into the materials and the design to where it's not lying to you.
Yeah.
Although it's funny that a lot of these transformers in most of our commercial buffer boxes are not necessarily designed to be on the pedal board side of things.
No.
It really should be at the amp to be most effective.
Yeah. I remember this was probably 15 years ago now. Gosh. It was one of the most intimidated times I'd ever been. I'd called Jensen for that same reason. Like, I'm reading the data sheets, and I know we all use the input transformer on the pedal board side, but the data sheet seems to indicate that that's not appropriate. So I called Dave Hill, who was at Jensen at the time, and he was like, I don't really know the answer to that. Let me give you Bill Whitlock's home phone number. Bill Whitlock, he's written tons of AES papers and is as hardcore a real engineer as it comes. He developed the that 990 op amp with Jensen in the beginning, and I'm like, wait, I don't want to talk to Bill. He's going to find out I'm a fraud, and I have no business talking to him at all. And but I wound up calling him, and he said, yeah. He goes, it probably doesn't make a huge difference for what you're talking about, because the impedances are also high. That's why it works, because you're driving this 1 meg input impedance. It's not a very tough load. It's fine. I remember years ago we did this rig for Babyface, and he had 100-foot run after that Jensen transformer, and you could start to hear it then. Yeah. But it took a pretty good distance for that capacitance.
And where's the buffer driving it though?
It was, but you're fighting the secondary parasitics. So they were buffer driven, but because the load was so heavy, there's losses introduced on the secondary side. So that was, I feel pretty good up to about 30, maybe gusts up to 40, 50 feet with the JT11P1. And nothing beats listening to it, to something Grant said earlier. A man with an experience is rarely is rarely at the mercy of a man with an argument. So if you've listened to something and it works for you, then what difference does it make what the tech specs say? And that kind of dovetails into the buffer thing. Yeah, it's a good idea to have one. It'll help. And more often than not, it's helpful. I learned that from that little switch on the KTR. It says almost always better and almost always worse. That convinced me. If Bill Finnegan says it, it's got to be true. And so I'm not too, listen with your ears. And see what works for you.
Well, the irony of that test is most people that I know who've done it do it with the pedal on.
Right.
So it doesn't really do anything at that point. Right? Because it's already in the circuit.
Pedal's you got to turn it off.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to turn it off. But
because there's people like, oh yeah, definitely this one. I was like, yeah, you got it.
But I'm sitting here looking at the Klassen schematic, because you mentioned it, so I pulled it up real quick. I mean, I can see if this is faithful. Who knows what's right these days? I could see why this wouldn't be a great what the issues could be in this driving a bunch of cable. Again, if this is accurate to what's actually in the box.
Yeah, so, some context for this is when Barry and I were talking yesterday, we were talking about sort of common buffer style circuits. And one of the most popular commercially made buffers in terms of the typology, like what you see for sale with a buffer that's an input and an output and a DC jack, very commonly is derivative of the Klassen buffer circuit. And I think this ties into the Klon being such a popular pedal amongst guitar players, that the belief is that if the Klon is the epitome of overdrives, that the buffer component must be the best of the buffers that are available. And I've always thought that it was problematic, as I don't find that to be a great buffer. But Barry, I'll turn that back over to you. I just wanted to give some context to the listener about why we're talking about this schematic specifically.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different topologies, right? There's a lot of ways to skin the cat. You've got this op amp method, which just because something uses an op amp doesn't mean it's a Klon style buffer. I see a voltage follower here, and it's kind of the stuff around it which is going to dictate the performance. You've got Cornish always use that BJT buffer, which can be good. FET,
which is funny the way that he did it, because his is almost like half of a Boss buffer, or at least part of that circuit is like half of a Boss buffer. And he decided to use BJT, but run it really high in terms of the impedance. Like, because I think isn't his buffer? I don't remember if it's unloaded or if it's at 1 meg. But
I'm not sure. When I said Cornish uses a BJT buffer, I told you everything I know about the Cornish buffer. I
actually do think it's 1 meg. I think maybe there was some that I had seen that maybe he modified that were like 2.2. So I mean, not like super unloaded, but like a little bit.
That I don't know. It's awfully hard to bias up a typical BJT at a real high input impedance, because
that was the thing that's unusual about it, is that usually you would see people use like a JFET or something like that, and then like a Boss would use a BJT on the output.
Yeah, and the JFET is easier to bias at high impedance because the input, the JFET is a voltage driven device, because a BJT is a current driven device. You typically can't get nearly as high an input impedance with it. The thing with those single transistor, be they BJT or FET, is probably more true with the FET, is people will prefer them because they're not perfect. And the way that they overload is sort of, the FET in particular, the way that they overload.
The second order harmonics, the even harmonics. Yeah.
Because the way that they'll round out and stuff. So you have people, they won't say that it's colored, because saying it's colored is an admission of that it's been perverted. But they'll say, it's a little warmer, or it's got
musical.
A thing.
People use that
musical.
term with the Cornish. It's very musical.
Yeah. So, but what you're really saying is you like a little bit of distortion, and that's totally cool. So don't worry if you like that. You're not compromising. You're getting what you want, and enjoy it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, right? I mean, because I think that my version of this stems from using the buffer in essence as an impedance firewall. It's isolating the guitar from the pedal board and the pedal board from the amp. And so, like, if you want to start to alter the sound, you would do so by way of what is occurring between the guitar pickups and the front of the amplifier. Like if you're the guitar pickups in the input of the pedal board. So if you're saying, hey, I want a darker sound, maybe you're trying higher capacitance cable. Maybe you're going Belden 8412, or maybe you're going with a coily cable or something like that, that's going to have the most consequential impact of any cable on the pedal board, is that one that's coming from the guitar into the pedal board to begin with. Like maybe that's where you start to darken your tone. But I would like to, in my philosophy, it's like I want everything on the board to be seen as a consistent of an impedance as possible, and the performance of whatever's on the pedal board is as uncolored, as neutral as possible. In that, obviously, I know that that's not everybody's preference. They may like the musical buffer. They may like those things. But to me, that again is a perversion of the intent. Like the sound I'm always trying to get to is guitar into amp, short cable. Like that's the sound I like. I want that to be as representative, even though we've got 20 pedals. Now there's always going to be a compromise there. There's no buffer that's going to fully get you there, because there's just too many variables going on the pedal board. But that's always the goal. That's the philosophy. But I'd love for Grant to chime in here, because Grant also and I have been talking about buffers a little bit, and I feel like he is an important voice in the buffer community, being that he makes a buffer and kind of auxiliary accessories. Grant, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying listening, because it's always interesting to hear other people's perspectives on this stuff. But I think at the end of the day, it'll probably be no surprise. I don't have that many tricks up my sleeve, and I repeat myself a lot on the podcast. I just think you have to go with your ear. And I think the temptation is, and this again is less about us being guitar players, and like what Barry was saying earlier, this is more just people in general, myself included. It's just tell me the answer. Tell me what to get, and I'll go get it. And I don't want to do the A/B tests. It's too much work. I don't want to listen to 5 different, buffer types, or what happens if I put a super high output impedance pedal after a good puff. Like, I don't want to do any of that work. Just tell me what to get, and I'll figure it out. But I think at the end of the day, what really again improves us as musicians and as guitar players, the people that love this industry, is that you do have that experience. And a lot of the stuff when you're earlier on, you take for granted. You then figure out down the track, I was like, oh, maybe that wasn't actually as cut and dry as I thought it was. And maybe sometimes it is good to have a fully true bypass board, and it gives me this particular sound. So even over the years, I mean, I sometimes look back at all of our schematics, and there were times at the very beginning we were just using like a FET buffer. Then we went to op amps. Then we went to op amps at a 18 volts spread. Then we went back to FETs. Then we went back to op amps again with a new power supply. Like, there have been hundreds of changes and tweaks representing like, oh, is there a better way? Can I try this? Can I adjust it? And we have tried so many different things over the years. At the end of the day, just trying to get to something that would work for as many people as possible, while being as reliable and consistent as possible on the buffer side of things. And right now it's we're still on op amps now, and the schematic has definitely changed. And now I have people that know a lot more than I do, which isn't difficult, helping me out with this stuff. And so yeah, we're making changes again right now to new products and all that type of thing. And the buffers are hopefully going to get better, quieter, and work for longer and longer is kind of the goal. So I think right now I would be on your side, Mason, of the goal is to get to guitar into amp with as short a cable as possible is kind of what we're aiming for. I'm not aiming for a buffer that colors the signal and is more, in quotes, musical. I'm aiming for a buffer that kind of, to the best of its ability, you put it on a medium to large board, and you're trying to get back to making that board disappear. How do we get that guitar plugged into the amp? And so, yeah, it's a learning curve for sure, but it's a lot of fun. I have to say, I don't know, Barry, I don't think you'd be an engineer without having this trait, but it's a lot of fun to look back and so like, that was a really cool experiment I did for 3 months. Didn't like it though. Like, we didn't use any of that stuff. And now this is where we're at, and I think we're getting closer. And then in like a year from now, I'll probably be like, we can tweak more things. Like, we can change some stuff to make it better. And maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But that's kind of why I love doing like this. I was telling someone yesterday, like, this week has been crazy because I've taken on a bunch of extra hours to cover for some people. And I'm waking up at like 3:30, 4 in the morning to make it happen. And I love it. Like, I love coming into the office. And I just made cables this morning for 3 hours before the podcast. And I still enjoy it. It's just cables.
Listeners, go there and buy some cables from Grant.
No, please, not this week.
Not this week. Wait till next week.
But it's just a lot of fun doing this stuff. And I think for some people, they would hear that like you've spent, you've been tweaking buffers for the last 15 years. Like, that sounds like a nightmare. But for me, it's awesome. It's so much fun. And you just learn a whole lot along the way. But yeah, and other people will have totally different philosophies, and they'll be tweaking buffers or overdrives or delays. They'll be tweaking for, whole different reasons, and they will love it, and they'll get to a totally different end result. And who's to say who's right or wrong? Like, Some people will really love what I do for Goodwood. Other people will think I'm crazy. And like, I just don't like it at all. And that's just kind of the industry we're in. It's a ton of fun. And the people that love you, and the people that hate you are on YouTube.
Wow. Yeah, that's true.
It's such a good time. I say that. It comes with its pitfalls, of course. But there is such a panoply of good stuff out there. It used to be that if you wanted an interface, it had to be custom. And now you can get all this great off-the-shelf stuff from you guys and others. And people can try stuff and see what they like and see what works and what doesn't work for them. And it really is kind of an embarrassment of riches. And the fact that we've been talking about people getting hung up on choices, but there just is a lot of great stuff out there. And I think anybody out there who has option paralysis and feels like, well, I can't make a move because I don't know, or there's a chance that I might make the wrong move, just take it easy. And, nothing that you get at this point, I mean, for the greater part, is going to wreck what you're doing. So try it and see and enlist, kind of get a multitude of counsel and kind of see what are some general rules of thumb that seem appropriate to what it is that you're doing, and try it out. The stuff is inexpensive enough and readily available enough that you can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think with that note, I think it would be a good time for us to wrap up for today. We've gone a good hour and a half or so here, and I think that the world of tone is better off for it. And I want to thank Barry again from Xact Tone, aka XTS, for joining us today. I should add that in the show notes and description, we will have all of the credentials for Xact Tone listed. If you're considering having a pedalboard built, whether you're in the Nashville area or the greater USA or beyond, you can reach out to them. I should also mention that they have incredible pedals, several of which I own, including the Pegasus Boost, the Multi-Drive, their modified GE7, and their modified Boss Tremolo TR2. All amazing pedals. When they go up, ordinarily they sell out in a matter of hours, if not sooner. I highly recommend that you check out their offerings over on their website. I think that you will be pleased. They are guitar pedals built by guitar players and expert engineers, people like Barry. So definitely do check them out. And if you're interested, again, in any of the sponsors mentioned, that will also be in the description. If you want some Goodwood stuff, some Vertex stuff, all of our credentials will also be added there. And any final thoughts before we complete for today, gentlemen?
I had a lot of time. I was telling Barry before we started recording, I missed the first XTS, the first time you were on the podcast. And so this was actually a real treat for me to actually get to have a chat. Although in a public forum, it's still very good. Very good. So thanks for coming on, man. It was great.
No, it's really our pleasure. I know we've emailed and texted you guys over the years. It's really a pleasure to sit in a room with you guys, even if it is virtual. I think the stuff that you guys have been doing here and getting information out in a way that has context, I think is super helpful in a world that has become increasingly dogmatic in every arena. If we can give context to whatever dogmas there are in MI and guitars specifically, maybe that'll help things out on the whole.
Love it.
All right.
No, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for coming on. It's been fun. Makes me realize you guys all have great products. I should probably design one of my own so I can be up to par with you guys.
I was thinking, Brian, maybe your first product could be your pedalboard too can be a 10 in the dark. I think what Mason was saying at the beginning. I think that'd be a good shirt.
Oh.
Get your line of shirts out and
See,
yeah.
What's funny is while we were talking about ping and the pong, I kept thinking of like the yin yang symbol. Like, why isn't someone created like a ping pong symbol and make it like a washable tattoo, and I'll make that like a tramp
washable
stamp
tattoo,
or something.
Yep.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
All good ideas.
Yes. More to be explored. Barry, I hope that we can convince you to come back at some point in the future. It's always very revelatory whenever you're here. So thank you again for coming on. And,
Just let us know, man. We'll be here with bells on.
All right. Well, and until
hope that's
next
literal.
time, we will see you all as we make our way a little further to Tone Town. See you next week.
See ya.
Hey guys.
But yeah.